Remember back in grade school when we were all told the myth that the American Revolution was a fight against the idea of having kings rule over subjects, and that America introduced the greatest experiment in democracy the world had ever seen? Well, we've been seeing it crumbling for the last 10 years at least, but two recent stories, one from the Supreme Court and one from the fucking post office of all places, makes it clear that during the Trump administration, the idea of no kings is seriously under threat. Let's take a look. The first story came out on Saturday in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Chief Justice allows work on ballroom to continue. Let's have a look. The first story was published in Saturday's Philadelphia Inquirer right on the front page, so it must be pretty important. Let's take a look. Chief Justice allows work on ballroom to continue. We'll scroll past the byline, go past the destruction of the White House. Remember, folks, that's our house, ostensibly, right? Workers continue construction on the new White House ballroom as seen from the Washington Monument on Wednesday. Look, Trump has destroyed the fucking White House at this point. But let's get into the meat of the story. Chief Justice John Roberts on Friday allowed the White House to continue construction on President Donald Trump's $400 million ballroom project. For now, as the Supreme Court considers the Trump administration's emergency request to intervene in lawsuits over the project. The temporary order came hours before lower court rulings would have forced a halt to above-ground construction of the project because Trump didn't get congressional approval. Remember that, folks? Congress, the voice of the people, they didn't approve it. Trump's just acting like he can do this because he's the fucking king/president. It will remain in place until the Supreme Court issues a more durable decision, though the one-page document does not detail Roberts' reasoning or indicate when another ruling will be handed down. Roberts signed the order because he oversees emergency appeals of cases filed in the Capitol. This case tests the limits of presidential power. The case is coming before the nation's highest court as Trump, a Republican, fascist Republican, 6 of one, half dozen the other, exercises unparalleled assertions of presidential power and increasingly seeks to mold the Capitol in his own image. In his own image? What's next? Is he going to put his fucking face on our dollar bills? Probably. We are more like England than we thought. The administration has argued that the president has total authority to renovate the White House and other federal buildings as he sees fit, and that the ballroom project must be completed due to national security concerns. When Trump first announced the plans for a new ballroom, he did not emphasize national security. He said the project would be funded by private donations, including from himself. And this is a pattern, right? Republicans have consistently, since the time of Reagan, when they're ever presented with a challenge, they just move the fucking goalpost. Cheating asshats. The National Trust for Historic Preservation argues that Trump has no unilateral authority to undertake the work, which has included demolishing the East Wing. Lawyers for the preservation group accuse the White House of trying to outrun the courts by accelerating construction. A spokesperson for the trust said Friday that the order from Roberts is not a final decision, and the group is awaiting further action. We'll come back to that, because ostensibly it is a final decision, and I'll explain why. The full Supreme Court will likely weigh in next on whether construction can continue for the potentially long duration of the lawsuit. Trump said his administration is grateful for Friday's decision. I bet they are, writing in a social media post that the project is under budget and ahead of schedule. So was the reflecting pool. While litigation plays out, ballroom construction goes up quickly. So, a couple things here. Roberts couldn't he be about? So, a couple things here I want to talk about. Justice Roberts couldn't write more than a fucking page to justify this decision to let construction go on, despite the fact that lower federal courts have said that this is unconstitutional and largely illegal? That makes no fucking sense. When the kids were in school, I made them write more than a fucking page when they were trying to ask me to drive them to the goddamn grocery store. Show your argument. Show your homework, you lazy fuck. The other problem I have with Justice Roberts is that his Supreme Court has ruled in favor of Trump upwards of 90% of the time. And if we take a look, of the 9 justices, here's what Newsweek tells us about the scandals that these justices have faced. Clarence Thomas in the 2020 election cases. Thomas faced criticism after it was revealed that he had not recused himself from cases related to the 2020 election despite his wife, Virginia, having reached out to the Trump White House and lawmakers, urging them to overturn election results. So Clarence Thomas, a Supreme Court justice, sided with insurrectionists. That's a problem. Reports in early April 2023 suggested that Justice Thomas failed to disclose numerous luxurious gifts and trips funded by a wealthy Republican donor. Thomas issued a statement saying he was not required to disclose the trips, and then a third one that he apparently, with his benefactor, Crow, had made a $100,000 property deal that he didn't think was important to report to anyone, even though Crow had fucking cases in front of the court. Then there's Neil Gorsuch. You remember him. In May 2023, Politico reported that Justice Neil Gorsuch sold a property he co-owned shortly after becoming a justice. He disclosed the sale, but omitted that the property was sold to the chief executive of Greenberg Traurig, one of the country's biggest law firms that frequently has cases before the court. An existing business relationship between 2 Supreme Court justices and 2 separate interested parties who always have cases in front of the court. No compromise there. Then you get to Samuel Alito, and this guy and his wife are fucking special. So in June 2023, it was revealed that he had not disclosed gifts from donors. Specifically, he accepted private jet flights totaling over $100,000 from hedge fund billionaire Paul Singer, who has had over 10 cases before the High Court. One of the cases where Alito voted in the majority led Singer to a $2.4 billion payout. Alito did not recuse himself from cases involving the wealthy investor. Alito also stayed at a luxury lodge on a 2008 trip to Alaska funded by conservative donor Robin Arkley III. And with that, the pressure was so much that he wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, claiming that the charges against him were not valid and that he spoke to Singer only a handful of times. I don't know about you, but it only takes one time to speak to someone when you're bribing them. And then there's Samuel Alito, the third of 9, so we're up to 30% of them now. The New York Times reported that an upside-down American flag was spotted outside the justice's home in January 2021, less than a week after the January 6th U.S. Capitol attack. Alito, being the man that he is, deflected responsibility for the flag to his wife, Martha Ann, telling the Times that he had no involvement whatsoever in placing the symbol on his front lawn in Alexandria, Virginia. Apparently, he has no say in what goes on in his own house. I believe that. The Times reported on a second flag at a second Alito property on Wednesday that displayed an appeal to heaven in July and September 2023. The symbol is rooted in Revolutionary War era naval vessels under first U.S. President George Washington, then Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. But as the Times reports, the flag has been used by conservatives in recent years, including by some Trump supporters during the Capitol attack. So there's 3. A third of the Supreme Court wrapped up in scandals where they have compromised their legitimacy as neutral arbiters of the law. We didn't even get to Kavanaugh graping somebody in high school and Alito and Clarence Thomas doing the same back in the early part of his career. That brings us up to 4 of the 9. And Justice Roberts is the tipping point. He's the 5th. right? So even if this does come before the Supreme Court, 5 are already in the pocket for Trump. My problem with you, Roberts, is that you know these guys are compromised, and you, as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, have failed to discipline your own group at all. You seem to think that by virtue of the fact that they were appointed and confirmed, that all responsibility for being law-abiding citizens no longer applies to you or your underlings. That's a problem. So what does Justice Roberts' declaration do? It makes it so it's impossible for the Supreme Court to pull back the ruling. They could delay this ruling for up to a year. By then, you're up to a year into construction, at which point it gives the justices an easy out. They'll just say, oh, well, it's so far along now that we should just let it go through, ignoring the fact that it's illegal, has been deemed unconstitutional by lower courts. They'll skip passing and they will skip rendering judgment on whether or not it's constitutional and just let the clock run out, bowing down to the king as they always do. The second and possibly more troubling story appeared on page A2 of Sunday's Philadelphia Inquirer. The headline reads, Postal Service publishes plan to comply with Trump mail ballot order. Let's look at this one. The Postal Service on Friday published regulations that would restrict mail voting, its latest effort to comply with President Donald Trump's call to restrict the popular practice just months before the midterm elections. In a 95-page final rule, the Postal Service clarified how it would carry out an executive order Trump signed in March, which sought to restrict mail ballots and create state-by-state lists of citizens to help determine voting eligibility. In the rule, the Postal Service said that it would deliver mail ballots only in states that shared voter data with the federal agency. Before the Postal Service accepts ballots into its system, the agency would review every envelope for compliance with the new standards, including by checking that the recipient was enrolled with the Postal Service to receive a mail ballot. If the regulations are enacted, the Postal Service would not deliver mail ballots to states that do not comply. Trump's executive order was largely blocked by federal courts this summer, and the Postal Service said in its rule published Friday that it would, quote, not take actions to implement the rules specifically for the 2026 election unless and until the government obtains relief from those injunctions. In a filing to the Supreme Court, the Justice Department said that the government would not enforce the rule unless the court ruled in its favor. The Supreme Court is reviewing the issue and could rule at any time. A Postal Service spokesperson on Friday declined to comment, citing pending litigation. Trump has repeatedly made unfounded claims that mail voting is quote-unquote cheating, even as he has voted by mail in multiple elections, including earlier this week. The president has acknowledged that combating fraud is not the only reason to target the practice. In March, he told Republican lawmakers that passing a strict voter identification law, cracking down on mail ballots, which Democrats now use more than Republicans, would, quote, guarantee the midterms for his party. This story is the most disturbing of the two for a couple of reasons. First, an obvious reason is that this is a fucking executive order. It's not like it went through any sort of process where legislators got to rule. It's not like they've had any attempts to compromise or any attempts to make this a legitimate thing. Once Trump's out of office, that executive order disappears, right? It's not law. It's the dictates of a king. Second thing is the post office making claims that it's going to act immediately if the Supreme Court sides in favor of Trump in this unfounded bullshit way to hijack elections. That's beyond their purview. The post office has one fucking job. I put a letter in the mailbox, it gets to the place I addressed it to. They should not be verifying anything on mail that has to do with whether or not I personally asked for a ballot. And the fact that they're threatening not to deliver any ballots from any states that refuse to comply with Trump's fascist order to turn over voter rolls means that states like California, Pennsylvania, New York, 3 large states, will have a huge block of their voters disenfranchised. That's unacceptable in a democracy. That's it. Thanks, folks. Talk to you soon. Bye.